Good evening. Good to see you all this evening. Hope you've had a blessed day. Well, my pulpit Bible went MIA, but Buck got me another one, so I'm restocked. And it's bigger print, so I can actually read it, which is a good thing. I've been in Samuel and starting to get to this point in the story of Saul. Of course, we've kind of got an idea who Saul is. We've kind of got an idea of, Saul's nature, Saul's character, what we can expect of Saul. But as times went on, Saul has become more and more sure of himself. And in the Bible, that's always a really bad, really, really bad idea when you begin to get more sure of yourself. And when he begins to do this, you really start to see a shift in the terminology of this passage, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we go through this. Whoever wrote Samuel wanted you to come away with a certain idea of Saul and a certain idea of what's going on, and he expressed this with these words. And like I said, as we start to go this, you almost begin to see a shift in the text when it comes to Saul towards the end of chapter 15. But in this case, God gave Saul a command. He says, I want you to go to Amalek and utterly destroy them, And I know that seems that, we say, well, that's just genocide, right? Well, that's basically what it is. It's genocide, right? God said, this nation, I'm going to punish this nation, and God says to utterly destroy this nation, everything, all their stuff. This is really similar to Jericho, right? When they marched on Jericho, and God said, utterly destroy everything, and then, of course, Achan didn't, right? Achan took some stuff, buried it in his tent. They got defeated at Ai. So, when God says to do it, regardless of what it is, he expects you to do it. He expects that to be done. I think when we look at the Old Testament, we think, well, that's cruel. God was really cruel in the Old Testament. And I guess, that's true. There's no mistaking that. When God destroyed these nations, utterly destroyed these nations, we do see that side of God. We do see a side of God that is judgment, that is judging. We see a side of God that's punishing. We see a side of God who really carries out what he says he's going to do. The truth is, it's the same God. It's just we kind of sin on credit these days. There's a destruction coming. There's an end coming. This hasn't changed. It's just we're going to do it. We're going to do it after the fact now, right? God's not punishing us as we go along. We're waiting till the end. I think heard somebody reading out of Hebrews the other day, and not forsaking the assembly together as a manner of some, but encouraging one another all the more as the day approaching. And I almost wanted to walk up to him, and I want to say, why don't you read a little further than that, right? It says, if you go on sinning willfully after receiving knowledge of the truth, there remains no more sacrifice of sins, only expectation of the fiery judgment to come. If God didn't spare the ancient world, why would he spare you? The Hebrew writer basically says it's the same God. If God didn't spare them for being wicked, God's not going to spare us for being wicked. This hasn't changed. It's just God's not going to rain hellfire down from heaven to destroy us if we're wicked today. It's not how this works anymore. We don't work like that anymore. And God's not necessarily gonna it rains on the just and the unjust, right? In other words, God doesn't really work the same way he did back then. That's not kind of how God works today. And so even though you look at this and you're like, man, this is cruel, this is, God's he's destroying the Amaleks because of what they had done and because they had not turned to God and because he said he was going to do it, and now he's going to use Saul to carry this out. Judgment has come upon these people. Just as much as judgment's going to come upon us, judgment's going to come upon those people. And when we read this, we're like, well, what about the little kids? What about the babies? What about, God's going to take care of that, right? You have to have some faith that God's going to take care of that stuff. So, this is a case where Saul was told to do something. This was not unusual in Saul's time. It was not out of the ordinary for God to say to do this. They had destroyed all the people in the land that they had possessed, right? To take their house and their land and reap from the vineyards they didn't plant. So this is nothing new. Saul had a job. Saul, number one, he numbers them. If you look at that, then Saul summoned the people and numbered them in Telem, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 men of Judah. And Saul came to the city. That's the beginning of what's wrong with this. I know you might not think that, but that's the beginning of what's wrong with this. You know, who's Saul relying on here when he numbers people? Relying on himself, right? He's relying on his ability, his army's ability to win. Well, God said go do it. If God said go do it, who should you be relying on? God, not yourself. You know, he already made a mistake right now. So they go up and they defeat him, right? But listen to what they do. So they capture Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive. They utterly destroy all the people. Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and the oxen and the fatlings and the lambs and all that was good, and were not willing to destroy them utterly. But everything despised and worthless, that they utterly destroyed. You see, he made a decision, didn't he? He made a decision not to do what God said to do. But you got to get into the text to really understand the mindset of Saul and the mindset of God. So to you and I, it's pretty clear at this point. There's something in this that has always kind of, I've always thought about in this passage, and it's Samuel. You know, we forget Samuel here. Samuel anointed Saul king, right? Samuel anointed Saul king. Samuel's seen a lot of people fail, right? I mean, he saw Eli fail. He saw Eli's sons fail. He saw his own sons fail, right? Samuel saw a lot of people fail. And here he's got Saul. And he thinks, you know, Saul's going to be the guy. Samuel's getting old here. And God comes to Samuel, and he tells Samuel, he says, I regret that I have made Saul king. How can God have regrets? If God purposes everything, then how can God regret what happens? You ever ask yourself? Some people think God purposes everything, right? God chose Saul, right? God purposes everything. If God purposes everything, how could a God who purposed everything have a regret? Could he? Right. Right, and that's exactly what this says. Yeah, Billy. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's because Saul had free will. I mean, Saul decided to not do what God said to do. God didn't make him. You know, Saul made that decision on his own. God didn't make him do it. It's like Amy says, we're not puppets on a string. You know, God can have regrets. God regretted making mankind when he destroyed the world in the flood, right? God regretted making mankind. So God can definitely have regrets because we don't perform, we don't do what God wants us to do. Don't act like God wants us to act. And that's what he says. I regret that I've done it, for he has turned back from following me. And Samuel, the part of the verse that always gets me is poor Samuel. Samuel was distressed and cried out to the Lord all night. You know, why was Samuel distressed, do you think? Was he, you know, why didn't he just say, well, you know, God, I told you this Saul wasn't a very good guy to start with, and went to sleep, right? You know, why was Saul distressed all night? You know, Samuel. I always think about Samuel here. And I think, you know, why was Samuel so distressed over Saul's failure? Do what? Right, he knew it was going to affect all of Israel, right? Saul was the leader. Saul was the one you should be looking up to. Saul was the guy that's supposed to do the right thing, and Saul didn't do it. And Samuel takes ownership, you know. Samuel didn't just say, well, God, you told me to make Saul king. Samuel takes ownership of it. You know, to him, it's his failure. You know, I've baptized a lot of people that aren't here that have quit coming. And to me, that's my failure. You know, I always feel that way. I can't help it. People say, well, it's not your fault. Well, I always feel like it's my fault. You know, Johnny Dewey said something a long, long time ago, and he said, you know, he said the worst thing about baptizing people is when they don't make it. And that's the truth. That's honest to God truth. That's the worst thing about it, when they don't make it. Because I always feel like I failed. Because I always take ownership in that. And that's what Samuel did. Samuel took ownership. He took ownership, even though God made the choice, even though God said, you pick Saul, right? Samuel still took ownership. Samuel said, well, maybe I should have been a better advisor to Saul. Maybe I should have been more involved. Maybe I should have. Do you think Samuel cared enough that Samuel said, maybe what should I have done different? You know, Samuel was looking at himself. He wasn't blaming God. Samuel was regretting it. Samuel was looking at himself, his own failures. And I think when we do that, that's what keeps preachers awake at night, you know. That's what keeps Samuel awake at night. It's what keeps me awake at night. Our failures, you know. And I mean, you can look at that a lot of ways, and it's easy, and everybody will say, well, it's not your fault, it's not your fault. But it's still, I take ownership in that, because I think we all have to take ownership in the souls of the people around us. You know, I think we all have to take ownership in that. And I think that's why this verse always bothered me, because Samuel could have just put it off on God. Samuel could have put it off on Saul. Samuel could have put it off on anybody, right? But Samuel was distressed, right? He was distressed because Samuel took ownership of the situation. He looked at his failures in this thing, not just Saul's failure, but Samuel looked at his own failure. And that's hard. It's hard to do. But Samuel was that kind of a person. He had that kind of heart. And I think that speaks a lot for Samuel, for who Samuel was. You know, we don't often think, I need to be a Samuel. That's not somebody in the Bible that we kind of hold up. You know, a lot of people say they need to be a Samson. You don't need to be a Samson. Samson was a mess up, right? I mean, you don't need to be Samson, right? If you're going to pick somebody, don't pick him, right? But I mean, a lot of us say, well, I need to be like somebody, or I should be like that person. We don't often hold Samuel up and say we need to be a Samuel. But man, that's one guy in the Bible that he just really didn't do anything wrong. You know what I'm saying? I mean, he just didn't do anything wrong. He was ministering to the Lord from the time he was a little baby. His mom left him. We read the story. His mom left him there. He ministered to the Lord from the time he was old enough to walk, old enough to be weaned. He served the Lord his whole life. He traveled all over. He did what the Lord told him to do. He's one of those guys. And Joshua's one of those guys. Joshua never messed up. You know, I mean, if you want somebody in the Bible that really never messed up, Joshua's your guy. Show me where Joshua messed up. Joshua never messed up. He just didn't. He was the one that went over, said we can take the land. He's the one that led people into the promised land. He's the one that fought his whole life for the Lord, gave the people the land. At the end of his life, he said, you know, choose day you will serve, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Joshua never messed up. Joshua never faltered. Joshua never gave up on God, and God never gave up on Joshua. And Samuel never gave up on God, and God never gave up on Samuel. You know, lessons in this is that life is long and life is hard, and a lot of people are going to disappoint you. And boy, if you look at Samuel's life, he had a lot of people disappointed him in a big way, including his own sons, right? And yet Samuel never gave up. Samuel never lost his faith. Samuel never lost sight of God. Samuel never quit loving God. Never. So, you know, a lot of people say, well, I want to be a Peter. I want to be a Paul. You know, I'd like to be a Samuel, you know, because in my opinion, there's not a much higher person that had much higher regard in the Bible than Samuel. He's just one of those guys. And you see it in this text. And that's what whoever wrote Samuel, I don't know who that was, whoever wrote this book, he wanted us to see Samuel this way, you see? And that's important. He wanted us to see Samuel like this. He didn't put any bad about Samuel. Did Samuel never do anything wrong? Probably. You know, who hasn't, right? But it's not in the text, right? So whoever wrote this text, whoever wrote 1 Samuel, they didn't want, the picture they wanted us to have of Samuel was this picture, right? And I just think it's powerful stuff when you think about it that way. Samuel rose early. Samuel came to Saul. Saul said, "Blessed are you of the Lord." I really want you to start looking at some terminology. We're about to get there now. Really look at the pronoun use when we start to get into this passage. So I think it's significant. He said, Saul said to him, "Blessed are you of the Lord. I've carried out the command." And Samuel said, and this is one of I think this is a verse I always laugh at, but Samuel said, what then is this bleating of sheep in my ears and the lowing of oxen which I hear? Right? I mean, he just called him right out, right? I mean, if you did it, why are the sheep bleating, right? Why are the oxen lowing, you know? You didn't do what God told you to do. And it's so, and if you really, when we get to this, Saul said, "They have brought them from the Amalekites for the people. Now, featherless sheep and ox sacrifice." Now listen to what he said. I want you to really look at this pronoun usage in 15. Do you see it? Huh? Yeah, who's God? You see it? See how the pronoun shifted? It's not Saul's God anymore. You notice that? It's your God. You know? You see? And when you look at it that way, that would upset me. That would upset me right there. That upsets me. Pronoun usage, it used to not bother me, but I tell you, how you use pronouns, it depicts your ownership in something, right? Is it your church or is it our church? It kills me when people say your church. Kills me. You know? It's our church, right? It's our assembly. It's our family. It just kills me when we get away from that, when our pronouns become very personal or when they become very third person. That bothers me in the church. We got a letter from a guy one time. He wanted support. They always send in letters wanting support, some missionary thing, whatever it was. And the whole letter, it was I, me, and my, whole letter. I'm going to do, the whole letter. And at the end of the letter, I thought, there's no way I'd support that guy. Because the whole letter is about him. And if you're really in ministry, if you're really trying to help somebody, then it shouldn't be all personal pronouns, right? It should be we, us, our, right? We know when Slinky first started staying with us years ago, first came into the house years ago, and he was time to eat or something. I called him on the phone, and I said, "Where are you, boy?" And he said, I went by Sonny to get me something to eat because I was hungry. And I said, "Boy, you're going to back that up. I'm going to put in some more information right now." I said, "This is a family. It ain't no I, it's we, and you better call us because it's our dinner, it's our life, this is our family. It's not me, mine, I." Because that was his mentality, and that's not the mentality you have when you're part of a family. That's not the mentality. And I think when we as a group, we need to think about how we take ownership in our stuff, right? And I think it's important that we do that because Saul didn't. In Exodus 34, when God got mad at Israel and God said, "I'm not going to go with you because you've done this terrible thing and I might destroy you along the way." But if you really read the text, God tells Moses, he says, "Take your people and go." God wouldn't even call them his people anymore. God says, "Take those people you brought up and go to there. because God wouldn't call them his people anymore because they had done that terrible thing. God wouldn't even call them his people. And Moses begged for God to go with him. You know, this type of stuff in the Bible, yeah. Yeah, that's what I mean. The pronouns start to pop out on the page when you get down to this part of the story, you know. Deflection, right? They did it, right? Your God, they did. And Samuel says, though you were little in your own eyes, were made to be head of the tribes of Israel, and the Lord anointed you king. You know, he's almost going to tell David the same thing. When David has his great sin with Bathsheba, he's more or less going to say the same thing. He says, I took you from here, I made you great. I did all these great things with you, and I would have done even more if you had asked me. But instead, you chose to do it your way. And when he does that, he says, why? But see, Samuel brings it back to Saul. Because whose fault is it ultimately, right? Saul's fault. He's the king, right? He says, why did you not obey the voice of the Lord, but rushed upon the spoil and did what was evil? And Saul said to Samuel, I did obey the voice of the Lord, and I went on the mission on which the Lord sent me, and have brought back Agag, the king of Amalek, and have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. Saul said, I did obey the voice of the Lord. I did it. You see? In Saul's mind, he was right. Saul thought he did the right thing, right? And the people took some of the spoil, and once again, here's this deflection, took some of the spoil to sacrifice to the Lord, once again, your God, right? And God says, you know, I'm not happy with sacrifice, right? But with a pure and contrite heart, am I happy? And Samuel said, as the Lord is much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifice than obeying the voice, behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is a sin of divination, and insubordination is iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he also rejected you from being king. You know, and this, you know, it's funny because here Saul's going to keep being king for a while. We're not introducing David yet, because you got to get, and don't, we'll have to get into this in a little bit, but, you know, there's sort of some weird chronological sequencing going to go on in here too, so we'll get into that. The people listen to their voice. Therefore, it says, now therefore, please pardon my sin, return with me that I may worship the Lord. But Samuel said, I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king. And Samuel turned to go. Saul seized Jezreel's robe, and it tore. And so Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, and has given it to your neighbor, who is better than you. Also, the glory of Israel will not lie or change his mind, for he is not a man that he should change his mind. You know, it's the idea, when you get an idea of how hard Saul held on to him, right? I mean, Saul held on to him so hard that he tore his robe. You know, Saul didn't want him to go, right? Saul wanted to fix this after the fact, but God had already made up his mind. There was no repentance. Nothing was going to come. Nothing was going to bring this back. The decision had been made. God had made the decision, and he said, I sinned, but please come honor me now before the elders, before Israel, and go back with me that I may worship the Lord. And Samuel went back following Saul. Saul worshiped the Lord. And Samuel said, bring me Agag, the king of the Amalekites. And Agag came cheerfully. And Agag said, surely the bitterness of death is past. But then Samuel had to do what Saul would not do. Samuel said, as your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women. And Samuel hewed Agag to pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. And Samuel went to Ramah, and Saul went to his house. And Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death. For Samuel grieved over Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. You know, it's a really sad chapter of the Bible, isn't it? Kind of trying to shut the door on this. You know, what did Saul do wrong? Why did God reject Saul? Why is he going to look for somebody else? I mean, the writer's wanting you to kind of take all this in. But, you know, even in this, Samuel did what Saul didn't do. You know, Samuel, like I said, Samuel was God's guy all the way through. And Saul didn't obey what God told him to do. We're never right in our own minds. You know, there's so many things we make right in our head that aren't right. We rationalize, we justify things that aren't right because for a lot of reasons. But you know, we can never make wrong right. You just can't do it. Opinions don't matter. It's just what God says that matters, what the truth is that matters. And you and I have to put ourselves underneath that truth. It wasn't Saul's place to argue. It wasn't Saul's place to make the decisions that Saul made. And sometimes it's not our place to do that. It's our place to obey what God tells us to do and not to question that. So there's a lot in that chapter. I think it really starts to exemplify the man Samuel was, even at the end of his life. And it starts really to kind of see all those flaws we talked about with Saul, how all those were manifest in this. His pride, right? His jealousy, his desire to be worshiped, his desire to be seen as righteous even when he wasn't righteous, right? Come back and worship with me, go before the elders of the people, make me look good among the people, even though I did what was wrong, make me look good. Why? You know, pride, right? Pride, jealousy. It all comes to a head in this story. Are there any comments? He what now? Says so. I mean, the mistake had already been made, right? The deed had already been done. Finished off a Gog, right? Yeah. Yeah, he does. And, you know, this is going to go on. Saul was going to be king. But the torment that begins with Saul, and, you know, that's where we start to get in here is this, you know, Saul was good up till here, right? But he's not going to be good. You know, even though he's going to be king, he's not going to be good. You know, God, there's so much in this that I can't even wrap my head around it. We're going to get there, though. It says, the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you grieve since I've rejected him? Fill your horn with oil and go up. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite. For I have selected a king for myself from among his sons. And Samuel, of course, was scared of Saul because Saul doesn't want another king, so Samuel didn't want to go. And so he kind of makes this ruse. He's got to go up for this sacrifice. And so did you come in peace? It's funny because, you know, you see the power of Samuel. The power Samuel had over the people. So Samuel did what the Lord said, came to Bethlehem. Isn't that kind of interesting, this in Bethlehem? I always thought that was kind of funny because, you know, Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and where did Samuel go to get David, right? And isn't that kind of interesting? And it says, but if you look at it, it says, the elders of the city came trembling to meet him. Well, he just hacked the king in half, right? Not too long before this, word was out, right? So they come trembling and says, do you come in peace? Because they knew he had God's power. They knew he was God's man. And Samuel said, I've come to sacrifice, consecrate yourselves. And I think 7's a verse we look at a lot. You know, they bring in these boys, right? But God tells Samuel, he says, the Lord said, do not look at the appearance or at the height of his stature. Isn't that a real difference now? Isn't that a contrast between Saul and what he's looking for? You know, Saul was all good on the outside. Saul was taller than everybody, had big flowing hair, handsome, strong. Saul, big guy, kingly looking guy. And then God says, oh, but don't look at the appearance, right? Don't look at the outward appearance. He says, because I have rejected him, for God sees not as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. You know, David was a man, and as we begin the story of David, which is what we're beginning now, we've talked about Samuel, we talked about Saul, we got to this point, and now we're going to bring David in. So when you back up from the text again a little bit, and you need to ask yourself, just like we did with Samuel, it's like, so what's this guy writing Samuel? What's he want you to see here? You know, we looked at Saul. We see what he wanted us to see about Saul. Saul became prideful, jealous, all these different things. Samuel, on the other hand, we keep seeing Samuel is more godly, better. Samuel's character increases, right? As we go through the text, Samuel becomes stronger and stronger in the character, and Saul becomes weaker and weaker in the character. And now we're going to begin to look at David, and what he wants you to see is the contrast between Saul and David, this contrast of these two different guys. Not looking at the outward, but looking at the heart. Jesse, bring all these people by, right? It's not chosen any of them. And the 7 of the sons, but Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen these. And Samuel said to Jesse, are these all the children? And he said, there remains the youngest, tending a sheep. I always didn't like this part because I don't know how long they had to stand up, but I had a really hard time standing up that long. And I just think that would have been really hard on me to stand up till David came in. I just hope he wasn't too far out. I always think that. You know, we're not going to sit down until he gets there. And I'm like, who made that dumb rule? Right? but he says, we're not even going to sit down, right? And then you get the first picture of David. What do you mean? What's Rudy? What do you think of Rudy appearance? What is beautiful eyes, handsome? When you think of a Rudy appearance, red cheeks. I always got the ideas because he was outside with the sheep and he was, you know, out doing all those things, and he just had that look, you know, like you get when you're outside all the time, you know. And Samuel took the horn, anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. And Samuel arose and went to Ramah. So, you know, once again, there's some stuff in Samuel you don't find anywhere else in the Old Testament, and this is part of that. The Spirit of the Lord, you see that some in Samuel, 1st, 2nd Samuel. You don't see much of it in the rest of the Old Testament. And there's other things from the Lord here, so that we're going to talk about. So we don't exactly know what this means, and exactly know, but we're going to start to see that, and he's going to exemplify that, of course, as we start to get into this story. Do you ever notice in the Bible when somebody's chosen, like when the angel comes to Mary and says, you're going to have a son, he's going to be the Son of God, and then if you really kind of study, look at the story, you know, Jesus grows up and they lose him in the temple, right? And they're upset because he's lost and they're worried about him and they go back to find him. Have you ever really thought about that story? You know, I think if God came to me, I mean, I'm not a mother, so I don't know how to work out exactly, but I think if God came to me and convinced me, and well, I knew that I had a miraculous pregnancy by the Lord, which obviously she did, and he said, you're going to have the Son of God. Somehow I just don't think if I lost him somewhere, I'd be real worried about it. I don't know. I just don't think I would be. I mean, he's God's son, literally. He's God's son. You know what I'm saying? I mean, you can't, nothing's going to happen. I mean, you're good, right? But I mean, I'm not a mother, so I don't know how that works, but I don't know. I just always kind of wondered about that. You know, I mean, Mary should have been like, yeah, well, he's God's son. I mean, he'll show up, right? I mean, you know, it's going to be okay, all right? But, you know, it's one of these other cases here when you start to look at this story. And I think this is where we're going to have to, as we get through this, I have to look at some chronological ideas, but have you ever thought about when David, I'm just throwing this out there, y'all don't have to get mad at me, I'm just throwing this out there, but have you ever thought about when David, because we're going to get to the David and Goliath story right in 17, when David goes to fight Goliath, if this is chronological, which I'm not saying that it is, because I'm not 100% sure this is chronological, but if this is a chronological event, in other words, Samuel's came and he's anointed David, and the Spirit of the Lord has came upon David. Have you ever thought maybe that might have had a little influence with David saying, let me go out and kill this Philistine, because, I'm going to be king of Israel, and I'm going to be all right. I don't know. Just throwing that out there to think about. Don't get mad at me. I know we love the David and Goliath story, but yeah, and see, that's where we really get into some problems in Samuel. Well, right. Well, Saul didn't know him, but then the other thing as we get further into this, is that when they get David to come play the harp for Saul, it's like he doesn't know who he is. You know what I'm saying? And if he killed Goliath, then you think, well, he should know. And so, I think there's some chronological issues because the problem here, the guy who wrote Samuel, he wasn't so worried about time sequence as he was about building the character of David. How's he going to do that? He's going to talk about when he chose him and who he was. He's going to talk about this great victory he had with the Philistine over Goliath, and then he's going to talk about ministering to Saul. So I guess what I'm trying to say is sometimes you got to back up from this a little bit, and you got to say he's building, just as he built you a picture of Saul and he built you a picture of Samuel, he's now building you a picture of David, right? So you kind of got to think, what is he wanting you, how is he building this picture? What does he want you to know about David, right? What's he trying to show us? And sometimes that goal of presenting this character might come at the sacrifice of chronological events. So I think when you start to go from here up to the time of David actually becoming king, or actually playing before Saul, it can get a little bit confusing, because I'm not 100% sure you can go in here and say, this happened, this happened, this happened. You understand what I'm saying? So we kind of got to use a little thought, because like Brent says, it's really interesting, we go through this, so the Spirit of the Lord comes on him. If this is chronological, then the next thing's going to happen is David and Goliath. The next thing that's going to happen is David playing the harp for Saul, and it's always been a little confusing to me, and I know I'm getting ahead of where we're at, but it's always been a bit confusing to me in the text how if David defeated Goliath and Saul was going to give him his armor, and he was in the presence of Saul, and he had this great victory, and then when they go get David to play the harp for Saul, Saul says, who is this guy? It's always been a little bit of a question in my mind, exactly how that plays out. So, yeah. Well, that's what I mean. There's some stuff in here that's what I'm saying. As you go through this, sometimes you got to focus more on, what this writer's trying to show you about Samuel than necessarily about everything you can pick apart in the text. Does that make any sense? Because he is painting this picture. He's trying to give you this character picture of David. And so this is how it's going to start, but now it's going to get a little bit confusing, because as we get into this, got to go back.
But we also know that from the very beginning, David had the Spirit mind.
Right.
And God could have made sure nobody knew who David was up until the time he wanted them to know.
Yeah, well, I want to spend some time, and you're right, but this is where this is where, you know, it appears that David came and played to him at the end of 16. David played the harp, but in 17, it's like Saul doesn't know who he is when he goes to slay Goliath. So we need to kind of deal with that. And then also,
If you ask him, who are you? Who are you? Well, he maybe knows he's David, but who is this? Where'd he come from?
yeah,
What is it bigger?
I don't know. We'll look at it. I'm just saying it's kind of gets a little confusing in here. And then also, you know, we need to spend some time on 14 because I think that, you know, the other thing, you get this contrast that we need to talk about because when you go to the end of, Shannon, let me go back again. When you go to the end of this, if you look, and I think this is purposeful, and when you get to the end, when you get to 13, it says the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David, but then look, I want you to look at 14. It says the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord terrorized him. And I think that's something we need to talk about a little bit. So anyway, we're out of time, but I think this kind of gets into some really kind of hard text here in a way when we try to kind of put this together, but we just kind of got to back up and look at the thing the way that the writer wanted us, I think, to see it. So